Let's please welcome up the director, Nanfu Wang. So, welcome back under
Thank
some
you.
very different circumstances as last time. But it's really always a very impressive to watch your films and to continue to grapple with so many of the things that you're sharing with us. This film, of course, presents so many eye-opening questions about what we've just gone through. I guess I'd really like to know, actually, if this isn't too personal, if you could talk a little bit about the beginning of this film, because, after One Child Nation, I would have expected perhaps it would have been complicated for you to make another film where you were in China. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself as a documentarian, continuing to make films in a country where filmmakers are not necessarily encouraged to shed light on problems within the country?
Sure. First, I just wanted to say hi to everyone. It's exciting to see people in real life and to meet, face to face. Actually, this is the first time since I finished this film, I'm being with the audience, because the film premiered at Sundance virtually in January, and then in August it was on HBO. So, and also it's my first time traveling to LA in 2 years for something. So it's really exciting to be seeing everyone. Thank you for coming. And back to your question, yeah, I would say it is true that every time I made a film about China, it made the next movie more challenging, and I never know when would be the last film I could make in China. And oftentimes I felt I treated every film I was making in China as the last film, the last chance I could make a film in China. With this one too, it's a weird feeling because it's almost like I treasure that opportunity, knowing that there's no certainty or guarantee that next time I could make another film again there. So it's always like, I'm gonna do whatever I needed to do this time. After One Child Nation, I actually didn't plan on making another film in China that soon. I actually had projects that I was working on outside of China. And also every time I made a film in China, I would be like, I needed to take a break from China because it was so intense. So in January 2020, as you saw in the film, I went back to visit my family and had not planned to make a film. And usually I felt, again, there is a certain level of uncertainty about going back to China after I had finished the film, because I never knew how the authority would react, whether there would be any kind of a harassment, intimidation, whether they would take any action. So I would choose to go home and visit, and usually with my son or my husband and my son together. And if the sole purpose is just visiting, and I often feel they would have fewer excuses of doing anything to me. So anyway, in January 2020, I went back and the outbreak happened. And then everything else is in the movie. It was a sense of, I'm seeing like some Asian faces here, and I don't know if there are Chinese people here, but I think every Chinese person in January 2020 probably shared that sense of urgency and uncertainty, and also just outrage and sadness, because seeing what was happening in Wuhan, there were just days and nights that I was awake, felt like I had to do something, or I wanted to know what was going on, and just kept refreshing the news constantly, social media news. And I think end of January, beginning of February, I decided to make the movie, and that became the outlet for me to express a lot of the very intense emotions. I think later on, a lot of people in the world felt that feelings too. But for me, I almost felt like lucky to be a filmmaker, to be able to use my skills and to channel whatever I was feeling every day to do something. Yeah.
The last 5 or 10 minutes of this movie feel like, in addition to being terrifying, do feel like the beginning of a much larger investigation into something. Major changes in the sort of fabric of our world, and I am curious if this is the kind of thing that was so depleting emotionally and mentally that you need to step away from it, or if this was just the kind of like opening salvo in your sort of investigation of how something like this gets manipulated by people in power to solidify their status in the world.
I think it's the latter. I think I felt that it's strange, or maybe not, maybe natural, that during the pandemic and seeing what was happening around the world and in China, in the US, and around the world, I was more pessimistic about our future than ever I had been. And from very early on, I think March or April, and seeing everything, how it was unfolding, it was very clear to me that the film I wanted to make and I wanted to express has, I mean, little to do with the virus itself, with COVID-19. It's more of a political film, and it is really to examine the issues exist in our societies through the lens of the pandemic. But all of those issues existed before the pandemic, and it will continue existing after the pandemic. So the ending, I think, showed that pessimism. If I don't know if people felt that, but to me, it's like we're doomed. What can we? How can we? How can we recover? How can we ever overcome all of these things? We could get vaccine. That's, I think COVID-19 one day will be over, and it is unfortunate and sad that it took much longer than I even expected. But disinformation, propaganda, censorship, those kind of things, there is no vaccine to it, and there is no any kind of prevention that we can see right now. So so really, like, the end of the film is really the beginning of our time right now.
Yeah. I find the comparison that you make in terms of is this the free speech that we have here is this truly what everyone is so desperate to have, when the free speech that we're seeing exercised here is for some pretty alarming misinformation. Tell us a little bit about going into that section, because it is really fascinating to see how a lot of the things that we're seeing people exercise their freedom of speech for are not typically the things that we're used to seeing that right being used to express. And it is kind of making a lot of people sort of recognize, having to stand up for rights for things that seem like sort of contradictory to a lot of values, is sort of like a really complex moment in our society.
It is. It is because for a long time, I think me or people in the film in China that you saw who were critical tend to believe that the situation went out of control because of a certain level, the lack of freedom of speech, the lack of transparency. So when the outbreak started in the US, and we are seeing that the US government responded equally badly and poorly in a way. And then, of course, by May, we're seeing all those protests around the country. And I asked myself, why? You have freedom of speech, you have freedom of press. Why the disinformation, misinformation spread so just like the virus itself, complete out of control and hard to trace back. And for a long time, I was very just puzzled by this and trying to understand And also, I think I had certain bias about America, what the society is too. Um, and the question I ask myself is, does the freedom of speech really guarantee closer access to the truth? And I think no, because when there is an abundance of information and when there is no effective way of verifying information, then freedom of speech or press does not necessarily mean that is freer to getting to know the truth. And especially if the people who are controlling the narrative, who have the power to shape the narrative, is spreading disinformation or misinformation to begin with, then it's even harder for every ordinary people who are consuming the narrative to differentiate what is true, what is not true. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about some of the you have interviews that start or don't start, basically get shut down pretty quickly by people who are not willing to speak unless a certain person's present or a certain authorization's given. How do you get past that?
By showing it. Yes. Yeah, it is like watching those footage and knowing that both the people behind the camera and the people in front of the camera are showing certain self-censorship. And the censorship come from above, but also internalized to become themselves. Not wanting to be recorded, not wanting to say something. It was frustrating. It was like watching the footage and thinking, how am I going to get these people to talk? How am I going to be able to convince people, whether it's behind the camera, to keep filming, or the people in front to, which I understand they have jobs to lose, they have lives in China. Not everybody wanted to risk things, and not everybody felt that there was even significance to do that. So at that point, it's like, how do I show the censorship? Then it's showing it. So that was the solution. Yeah. And in terms of like eventually getting other people to talk, the ones who did open up, is a conversation. Is a conversation both. I think you can count on two people, I think, who were critical about the Chinese government, Pei En and the other guy, Ding. And both of them had gone through the journey of losing a family member. One is a mom, the other one is a father, and they realized that they couldn't be silent anymore, and they would risk everything to speak up. And the rest of the people, I think you saw in the film, they, even though are mourning the loss of the family member, but still in the end, thanked the government. And that is a thing that I learned during the making of a One Child Nation. Like, no matter how painful it was to lose the child, parents oftentimes come back and say the policy was good. So making this film, it wasn't completely shocking to me, but it was still surprising because the loss to me, it was more immediate in a way, that the turning around, to put it this way, the effect of the propaganda was very immediate. If you would say the power of propaganda during the one-child policy era took 30 years to change people's mind, to convince them that is a good policy, then this is, I'm witnessing the history being written over those 4 months in China. In February, I had thought if people in China, especially in Wuhan, in Hubei, they would ever have a political awakening and demand more transparency, demand an answer, that would be the time. This would be the critical moment that they got awake and say and ask for that. 2 months later, they didn't. Not only they didn't, the narrative has completely changed. And today, I think very few people, I think, still hold on to some of the painful memory, or if it's personal, but the narrative has been overall that the government did a great job and did everything they could. This was a natural disaster. There was like no way they could do anything differently. So that part surprised me, just how I'm seeing it happening in front of my eyes. I'm seeing the montage of the TV, the news, and the narrative that they promoted, and how that has been now deeply ingrained in people's brain. Yeah.
Even I was starting to get moved by it. It's that effective. I'm curious, once they did take control of that, trying to, once they stopped trying to suppress the idea that it existed and that they were going to take control of the narrative that COVID existed, it needs, that it needs to be contained, and then they bring out all these stories of the, delivering babies. How did that change your relationship being out in the field with the camera? Because I'm curious. Before, it's sort of like this contraband thing. People are trying to keep, don't you dare film this. Now you're sort of out in an area where suddenly cameras are probably everywhere. Did that give you access, or was it getting even harder because people were actually out there with credentials from the government saying, like, sort of pushing you out of spaces that you might have been able to get into?
I think it's both and it's neither, because it's true that people everywhere they filmed, they needed credentials. And I mean, the institutions, the hospitals, the first responder team, not people's private home. But in those places, any journalist or filmmaker needed credential, and the ones that helped us film didn't have credentials. But it doesn't make it easier for people wanting to talk, because they are they know what is good to talk about and what they're supposed to talk about. So if there are questions, if there are topics that are considered sensitive, very few people would be opening criticizing. First, like, I don't know how many people have that critical consciousness to think what the problems were and to ask questions. And if they do, how many are explicitly asking those questions? So then when we get to the third level, is the ones who both had the critical consciousness and then are asking the questions in their heads and are asking the questions on camera explicitly. That's the minority. Yeah.
Was there something particularly surprising to you, having I guess a good sense of, sort of how the Chinese government responds, and sort of understanding a little bit about how media globally works in terms of how information is being disseminated, how this unfolded? Did anything in particular just say, wow, that was not what I was expecting to have happen?
The ability to completely shape the narrative, to complete dominant, like, became this main narrative, is now the history in China. And also, I think to some extent that influenced how the world see it too, because I mean, the US and a lot of the Western countries happily handled the the outbreak. It became a tool for the Chinese government too, because now after April, May, the narrative not only is we effectively controlled the pandemic, but also the outbreak in China, but also look how bad the US is doing. And that became the news every day. Like, look at how many people died in the US, how many more. That was just bombarding the news every day. And even my mom, who lives in the village, is getting those like news alert every day about the data here and being concerned. So that's...
They didn't even have to fabricate that news.
Yeah, so that surprised me, just sadly. Yeah.
and as far as the way that the U.S. has responded in terms of its its relationship to its narrative about China, anything there play out differently than you thought it might?
Sorry, like I would.
The way that the U.S. government, I mean, because obviously we've got these two very polarized factions in our government,
Yeah.
And one that was very antagonistic,
Mm-hmm.
and the the way in which the finger pointing has happened over this pandemic, it's obviously there's a lot of it still going around, but there is still obviously narratives being written about like the sort of the handling of the beginning of the pandemic, and your film is also particularly damning about what happened in the very first month or so. But in terms of how that story is being written by the West, I'm kind of curious if there's anything surprising about it.
Yeah, definitely. I think the theories about it started from a lab or it was manufactured, and all of those. I think especially last year, even when we were filming the reopen protests, I remember in Chicago we had an Asian cinematographer filming and just got verbally, almost like physically abused, and that was thanks to the Trump administration. Like that narrative was complete shaped from the top to say this is, whether it's calling the name of a China virus and, so on and on. And it's almost like at that point, so we are seeing the two countries failed due to some of the problems from the top, the lack of transparency from the early on. But then as soon as they couldn't cover it up anymore, is where you were saying the finger pointing and almost like a competition is you, it's because of you and you are doing that. That I think it still has a long impact that we're living through every day because of that. The rising of the Asian crime is because of that, because of the early narrative that's calling it China virus. And this is interesting because you were saying that part of like how it's portrayed what happened in Wuhan in China is damning to currently the debate of what was going on, what China did. And it's almost like this movie, people watch half. I had some, I think, articles, I don't remember, like a blog post. If people just watch the first half, they'll be like, look, we're right. China is so bad. And then if they are watching the second half, look, we're right. America is horrible. So it's like both they can, if it's half of the movie, they feel like that's exactly the truth in a way.
Well, this does beg a question that I'm curious to, because you've spent so much time really thinking about this on, from both sides of how China's dealt with it and how the U.S. has dealt with it. Is there something from each side that you take away as something good that's been done?
No.
No.
Yeah, to me, it was always never a contrast. Like, let's say you did better this way, and we did like a little worse this way, because that to me, that's not the point. What's the government's role, and it's whether it's in regular time, ordinary time, or in a global crisis time like this, what do they prioritize? And what does government do? And regardless of a so-called democratic country or oftentimes would be labeled an authoritarian country, both prioritize preserving the power and its image over public health and people's safety. And there's really not anything good that I feel like I can say that they did. Just look at the consequences. Yeah.
On that happy note, let's expand this over to the audience.
Yeah. Structure, I think about it from the first moment I'm thinking about making a movie, I think. Just like, what is this movie about? How do I see it? What is the thing that I wanted to express? And it and that changes. I mean, every day probably is an exaggeration, but every week, every other week. And by changing, I mean every day if I shot something new, if I encounter something new, if I see, if I had a conversation with a subject, if I had a day footage from the hospital, the new material often gives me what is a confirmation or a new revelation, which is always the latter that is more interesting, a discovery of this is interesting, this is really making me question things, and then it made me question now what is the movie, what do I want to, what am I feeling, what are the questions that I want to ask, what are the answers that I am getting. And it's always a process that I was driven by several questions when I started, and those questions got answered, but then new questions arise, and then I'm trying to find out what are the new answers to it. And this film had gone through several of those moments, but I think the most crucial change was March, because before March, I envisioned the film to be just about China and to be about how China covered up the initial news of the outbreak, and how that has resulted in the severe situation, and how there is a huge discrepancy between what the government was telling people in the world that was happening in China versus what was the reality. And then in March, I was back here, and suddenly New York had the outbreak. And it was more shocking to me than I first learned the outbreak in Wuhan, because I did come here 9 years ago and thinking this is a country with freedom of speech, this is a country with democracy. And when I first came out, my family all felt, thank God you left. Thank God you're no longer here, because if you got sick, at least you would find care here. And it was not the case. I took my son. There was no test. I see people dying without care too here. And to me, I think to call it like a political awakening in the U.S. is maybe not an exaggeration, to just re-question what is this country and why is it here and how has it gotten here? Was it just the change over the past 4 years? I don't think so. And and the problems have been there, but did we just ignore it? Did we just, at least myself, not paying attention to it? So March, April, then I started really, that became the driven, I think, questions for me to explore in the film. Yeah.
Michael.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is really subtle to distinguish like the line between propaganda. Effective propaganda is a good storytelling. And I think so the line is really thin. And in terms of like how do we collectively as a society, as individuals, to learn how to tell like what is, how to differentiate that, and or how to verify information. I think that's really hard. And I hope like my one film, or I don't think it can do anything if it reaches one person and allows that person to watch it and then think critically and start asking questions that they didn't before, then I feel it does its job that I hope. But I don't think it can really do more than that. I think what we need is media literacy education. And I think like throughout, maybe from first grade or even and throughout the whole education system. And I think there is a lack of that. I think with traditional media, whether it's newspaper or TV, at least newspaper still has that fact checker. There is editors, there is people who are verifying the sources. But with internet, really there isn't. And I don't think we have effective way of regulating. And regulating, what does that even look like? Does it that mean just that it could, then that could be a thin line between censorship and regulation too. So I think the media literacy and to educate everyone from very young to how to do research and how to verify and how to check different sources. I think that's really important. I think that probably speaks to where we are today too. Such a big divide and with nice people too, on complete opposite side of political views, world views, because each side believe that they are holding to the truth.
Yes, in the back.
The first question is no, I wasn't able to. I don't think I have the power. I wish. I think that takes, and you can see how difficult even with governmental agencies and the non-governmental agencies institution. I think that's international effort, but I don't think I personally could. I'm a filmmaker. I can tell the stories. But the second question, whether the Chinese government made statements, yes, they did. And I believe the official statement is it originated from the wet market and yeah, from bats. That was the official statement.
I mean, they're not gonna like come out and admit it if it came from a lab, right?
Well, I am like for this film I've interviewed zoologists and people experts who aren't in the film, and I think sharing the same views of a scientist is like until you have proof, until you have evidence, speculation is always speculation and is pointless.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I agree that California has also done a pretty good job comparatively. I I happen to like what California has achieved. Well, we're also the largest populated state. I think that California has done some good things. It's my own personal opinion. I think the city of Los Angeles has also done some good things. Um, there are some states that have done worse. Yeah, there's the yeah. Yes. You, I mean, well, it's not mandate. Well, yes, Brian.
Uh, Um, First question, yeah, the shots that you saw are drone shots, and I didn't shoot it. There were a group of cinematographers, very talented. Um, Second question, yes, there were people watching it in China in a way that is the first of all, the film is on HBO and it is not um, accessible in China, but there was small groups of people were able to get access and saw it, and the I feel like the people who have access and saw it at the type of people are already thinking. So the film has new information that they didn't know, but also mostly resonates with them because they've seen it and then thought about it and in reality. And so I think I'm getting that kind of feedback that I already know. This are the type of people, the activists, the people who are critical, um, who would seek out this movie to watch. Um, that type of audience. It is. It is. It was difficult for everyone to experience. Um, More difficult.
Yes.
Um, yeah, what you were saying, it is true. It's the hatred. It's almost like for the greatest, not propaganda, but any crisis, like during wartime, it's always to create an enemy, to create an outside enemy, so we can for a moment ignore and forget about what we're facing inside. And that's been true, I think, during this time too. It's like to look at there is a there is an enemy out there, not like so. China definitely, I think, from all the news, has been calling the U.S. our number one enemy. Um, since I was little, that was just true for decades. But the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism during the pandemic is what I think is the most damaging. consequence of this pandemic, and it is the maybe the most overlooked because we're looking at it as this pandemic and hoping it could be over, and the kind of impact, negative consequences that you are saying are gonna last for years. And whether I would explore in the film project, I don't know yet. Oftentimes, my films the ideas have been very spontaneous, like, and it could be one day, one story, and just speaks to all the themes of the questions that I've been thinking about. And then I decided to make it because it's a perfect vessel to explore those questions. But right now, I haven't planned that. Yeah.
Anyone else? Well, thank you so much for making this your first screening back with an audience. What a treat! It's really wonderful to have you back. Thank you for always making such excellent films and sharing them with us. And I hope that we'll get to do this again soon.
Yeah, hopefully not another pandemic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yes,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.